The world just crossed a line it cannot walk back from. Right now, as you're watching this, the United States Navy has formally begun blockading Iranian ports along the Strait of Hormuz, and that one sentence alone should make every American stop and truly think about what we are living through. This is not a television drama. This is not speculation. This is the world's most critical oil chokepoint, the narrow strip of water through which roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas once flowed freely, now turned into a war zone with two nuclear-adjacent powers staring each other down across the water, and the world is watching, calculating, and choosing sides. Russia has fired back at Trump with sharp diplomatic language. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has promised severe consequences for any military vessel that dares approach. Brent crude surged past $103 a barrel in the immediate aftermath of the blockade announcement. The national average gas price hit $4.12 per gallon on Monday, and analysts are warning that is only the beginning. So before you take one more step in your day, you need to understand what is actually happening here, why it matters to your wallet, your country, and the future of the entire global order. Because what is unfolding right now in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a military standoff. It is the opening chapter of a world being fundamentally restructured. Let us start from the very beginning, because the mainstream narrative is not giving you the full picture. What you need to understand is that this crisis did not begin last weekend when J.D. Vance flew to Pakistan and came home empty-handed. It did not begin when Trump posted on Truth Social that the Navy would begin the blockade. This goes much deeper, and to understand the weight of this moment, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually means to the civilization we live in. That narrow waterway, roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the jugular vein of the global economy. Before this war began, about 20% of global oil supplies passed through the waterway every single day. Tankers loaded with crude oil from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, they all flow through that strait on their way to Asia, Europe, and beyond. When that flow stops, everything stops. Prices go up, factories slow down, supply chains crack, and ordinary people like you and me, feel it at the gas pump, at the grocery store, in the heating bill. That is not a theory, that is already happening. Now here is where it gets complicated in a way most commentators are not being honest about. When the United States and Israel launched what was called Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, striking military and government sites across Iran, Tehran responded in the way it had telegraphed for years it would respond, by closing the strait. And that closure triggered what the head of the International Energy Agency described as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Think about that phrase for a moment. The greatest energy security challenge in history. Not since the Arab oil embargo, not since the Gulf War, not since any previous crisis, the greatest in history. And yet somehow, despite those words being uttered, the American political and media establishment has been treating this as though it were a manageable escalation, a negotiable problem, a situation that just needs the right deal. But the facts on the ground tell a very different story. What happened in the weeks leading up to this blockade reveals the deeper strategic logic, or the stunning lack of it, that has brought us here. There was a ceasefire announced, a 2-week pause in hostilities, agreed to on the condition that Iran allow ships to pass through the strait again. Trump agreed to suspend planned bombing for 2 weeks if Iran reopened the Strait of Hormuz. And for a brief moment, there was a sliver of hope. Oil prices fell. Diplomats talked. J.D. Vance flew all the way to Islamabad to sit across from Iranian negotiators and try to hammer out a deal. 21 hours of negotiations, and then nothing. The talks collapsed. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said Tehran approached the negotiations in good faith to end the war, but encountered what he called maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade. Now, you can take that statement with whatever skepticism you like. Iranian officials are not exactly neutral observers, but here is the thing. When both sides walk away from a table blaming the other for moving the goalposts, you are not dealing with a negotiating failure. You are dealing with a fundamental incompatibility of goals. And that incompatibility is now being resolved not through diplomacy, but through naval power. So Trump announced the blockade. Standing outside the Oval Office after the blockade took effect at 10 a.m. ET on Monday, Trump told reporters, "We can't let a country blackmail or extort the world, because that's what they're doing." And from a certain perspective, that statement is not wrong. Iran was indeed charging tolls for passage. Iran was indeed using the strait as leverage. But here is where a more honest analysis has to push back on the simple narrative. The United States initiated this war. Those strikes on February 28th were a choice. There were alternatives: sanctions, diplomacy, covert pressure. None of those tools had been truly exhausted. The decision to launch major combat operations against Iran was a strategic choice with consequences that are now cascading in ways that no one in Washington appears to have fully planned for. Because now, weeks into this conflict, the United States finds itself in an extraordinary position, conducting a naval blockade of Iranian ports, with Iran vowing retaliation, with Russia and China having already moved to protect Tehran at the United Nations, and with America's closest European allies declining to join the blockade. Let us talk about Russia for a moment, because this is the dimension that the American mainstream media is most aggressively underplaying. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the US blockade will likely continue to negatively impact international markets, adding that this can be assumed with a high degree of certainty. Now, those words sound measured, almost diplomatic, but what Peskov is doing is not diplomatic. He is issuing a clear statement of position. Russia is not going to help the United States succeed here, and Russia has already taken concrete action to demonstrate that. Russia and China vetoed a UN Security Council resolution aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz, just hours before Trump's deadline for Iran to reopen the waterway. And they did not just vote no, they framed their veto in explicit strategic terms. Russia and China said the resolution was biased against Iran and that it was the wrong message to send after the US president's recent statement threatening the survival of a civilization. Read that carefully. Russia and China are not positioning themselves as neutral arbiters seeking a peaceful resolution. They are positioning themselves as a counterweight to American military power. They are telling the world, we are on the other side of this, and that matters enormously because it means this conflict is not going to be resolved through the UN Security Council. It means that the institutional architecture that the United States built after World War II, the architecture designed to channel great power competition away from direct military confrontation, is now being openly circumvented by multiple sides simultaneously. And then there is the Iran piece, which deserves far more careful analysis than it is getting. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps warned that any military vessels attempting to approach the Strait of Hormuz will be dealt with harshly and decisively. The IRGC is not bluffing. These are not hollow words from a bureaucratic ministry spokesperson. The IRGC has been Iran's primary instrument of asymmetric warfare for decades. They have attacked oil tankers before. They have used sea drones, fast boats, anti-ship missiles, and mines. According to one report, Iran lost track of some of the mines it planted in the strait, meaning it cannot fully open the waterway even if it wanted to. Think about the extraordinary danger embedded in that single fact. There are untracked mines in one of the world's most critical shipping lanes, and now the United States Navy is moving into those same waters to enforce a blockade. The probability of miscalculation, of an incident that nobody planned, but that nobody can walk back from, is not trivial. It is very, very real. Now let us talk about the economic consequences, because this is where the impact reaches directly into your daily life as an American. The numbers are already alarming. A senior scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy warned that a shortage of about 7 million barrels of crude and 4 million barrels of petroleum products is already not getting to market, and the blockade adds Iranian barrels to that shortfall. She added that oil prices will likely remain elevated and that we are looking at elevated oil prices certainly through the end of 2026. And that is not even the worst-case scenario. Analysts warned that oil could rise above $150 a barrel if the blockade triggers retaliation from Iran-aligned Houthis in Yemen, who could add to the disruption. $150 a barrel. If you want to understand what that means in concrete terms, think about the price of every single thing that moves in a truck, on a ship, or on a plane. Think about fertilizer prices. Think about the cost of plastics, chemicals, and raw materials. Analysts noted that the rise in oil and gas prices would also cause the cost of chemicals, fertilizers, and raw materials used to make plastics to increase. This is not abstract economic theory. This is the cost of living for every American family, every business owner, every farmer. This war is already being paid for at the gas pump, and the bill is not finished coming in. There is also a geopolitical dimension here that is deeply underreported: the position of America's traditional allies. You might expect that a US naval blockade aimed at protecting global shipping freedom would attract broad international support. After all, free navigation is a foundational principle of the international order that most nations profess to support. But look at what is actually happening. The BBC reported that the UK would not be assisting with the blockade, with a government spokesperson saying they continue to support freedom of navigation and the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. French President Emmanuel Macron announced preparations for what he called a peaceful multinational mission aimed at restoring freedom of navigation, which he explicitly described as strictly defensive, meaning France is conspicuously not joining America's naval enforcement action. NATO, the alliance that Washington spent decades building and funding, has not offered assistance. Trump repeatedly criticized NATO for not helping with policing the strait, saying he was very disappointed they didn't come. This is extraordinary. America's closest military allies are declining to join a US naval operation in a crisis that they themselves have described as a threat to the global economy. That is not a minor diplomatic awkwardness. That is a signal about how much of the world, including America's friends, views the legitimacy and wisdom of this entire enterprise. And then there is the deeper question that almost nobody in Washington is willing to ask out loud. What is the actual end state here? What does winning look like? The blockade is designed to pressure Iran to reopen the strait and come to the negotiating table. Trump himself said the goal is both of those things and more. But Iran has already signaled through the IRGC's statements and through the collapse of the Islamabad talks that it is not prepared to capitulate under this kind of pressure. And why would it? The IRGC Navy explicitly said that any military vessel approaching the strait would be considered a ceasefire violation and would meet a severe response. Iran is telling the world that it intends to fight, not negotiate, fight. And if Iran fights, if there is a naval engagement in the Strait of Hormuz between American ships and Iranian fast boats, if an American sailor is killed or an Iranian vessel is sunk, the ceasefire is over. The war resumes, and at that point, the question becomes not whether oil hits $150, but whether it hits $200, and whether this conflict pulls in other regional actors in ways that make the entire situation immeasurably worse. What makes this moment so genuinely dangerous, and more dangerous than the headlines are conveying, is the combination of high stakes, mutual intransigence, untracked mines in the water, unpredictable actors, and a global economy already buckling under the pressure. Gas prices nationally averaged $4.12 per gallon on Monday, already more than $1.20 higher than when this war began. That number is climbing. JP Morgan Chase analysts put it plainly: reopening the strait has become the market's most time-sensitive priority. The financial world understands what is at stake, even when the political world refuses to fully reckon with it. And ordinary Americans, the people watching their gas bills, their grocery bills, their heating bills, are the ones absorbing the cost of decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv and Tehran. Here is the core truth that no amount of political rhetoric can obscure. The United States started a war against a country of 90 million people, with deep regional alliances, asymmetric military capabilities, and the physical ability to strangle global energy supplies. Russia and China are actively shielding Iran at the UN and signaling strategic solidarity. America's European allies are distancing themselves. The global economy is absorbing shock after shock, and now we are in a naval blockade standoff in the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet, with both sides vowing consequences if the other side blinks. This is not a situation where you can simply declare victory and walk away. This is a situation that demands an honest national conversation, not about who is tougher, not about who blinked first, but about what the actual interests of the American people are, and whether those interests are being served by an escalating military confrontation with no clear exit ramp, an isolated America, and an economy that is already paying a price that will not easily come down. The water in the Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest. But what is happening in those 21 miles right now has the potential to reshape the global order for decades. Pay attention. Because history does not announce itself before it arrives, and it is already here.